Welcome back to the MOOC Studio. We're going to go over the summary of Week 5, Profiting from Your Innovation now. As you recall, this past week, we talked about protecting your idea. Furthermore, we talked about how do you make money relative to some of your ecosystem partners. Then we discussed legal aspects. And then finally, we talked a lot about scalability and growth. So let's get right to it and go through some of the key highlights of this past week. All right, so we began the week with a discussion about intellectual property and protecting your ideas. We discussed the distinction between intellectual property and real property. We talked a little bit about the motivation. Why do nations try and promote intellectual property, and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of it? And then we walked through the 4 main types of intellectual property that you will probably need to deal with in the early stages of your company's development. So we started with trade secrets, which is the most common form, which is basically just keeping something secret and telling everyone it's a secret. And then we talked about trademarks, which is a symbol that represents your company and how they work. And then we moved on to patents, which represent some kind of typically tangible item, but could also represent a process or even in some cases a method. And what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of holding a patent? And then finally, we discussed briefly copyrights, which refer to creative output. And we discussed how those work and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of those. So think of these. Remember that these are one piece in your arsenal of making money because, as you recall, the first step is to prevent others from copying you. We then moved on in the second segment to talk about complementary assets, which is everything required to commercialize a technological innovation besides the technology itself. So we discussed some examples of it, and we also developed a little framework about whether we should care about complementary assets or which ones we should care about and whether it's going to prevent us from making money or enable us to make money. And we ended up with this framework here where if we have on the left-hand side, we have imitability, which is referring to the ability of some competitor to, or anybody, to copy your product or service, ranging from low to high. And then along the bottom, we talk a little bit about the complementary assets themselves. Are they unimportant or freely available? In other words, you don't care about them, or you can easily write a contract to have access to them, or whether they are important and tightly held, which means that only one or a very small number of companies hold the complementary assets. And in which case, you, as the inventor, will certainly be in the driver's seat, as we say, in this quadrant where it's difficult to imitate what you're doing and the complementary assets are unimportant or freely available. That's here. There's also a chance that you can gain something in situations of low imitability, even if there's a tightly held asset. And chances are you're not going to make much money off this invention if indeed it is easy to copy your invention. So here the complementary asset holder will make the money, and here customers will win. Not to say that these are all bad places to be, because it's just a question of how quickly you move on to the next product. So up here, top half, you may be able to invent something and then make money from it for a longer period of time. The lower half of this figure, you probably want to move on relatively quickly from your invention to the next invention and come up with a new product frequently. So you're running, keep a run strategy. We then moved on to discuss legal issues, including what is liability? It's when you are held responsible for something. We talked about incorporation, what kinds of shares do you need to have, why managers and founders should always vest their shares, what happens if someone leaves your company. We talked about intellectual property filings outside of your country, so what is your overall global technology strategy? We discussed non-compete contracts, product liability, and even what to look for in finding a lawyer. And then in this very last segment, we talked a little bit about pivoting, what it is, and when you would want to do it. And here, this should be when your primary assumptions are wrong, when people have a hard time paying when you expected them to pay, when things change in your environment, when your sales cycles are too long. That's a sign that you should be shifting some aspects of your business model to take advantage of the needs that are actually out there. We discussed scaling up, and that means achieving higher sales volume using the same infrastructure. And we talked a little bit about what to do to make that happen. So you create the back end. You want to make sure that your marginal cost of adding more sales is low. And we also wanted to make sure that the organization itself can handle growth. Which led us to this final figure here where we discussed the relation between the size of an organization and the age of an organization, and the different stages that the organization usually passes through when it grows into a larger entity. And if you recall from this figure and from our discussion, the organization, the startup company, moves from the founder-driven organization in the beginning, accompanied by multiple crises at various points in time, to a more managerial-oriented, hierarchical company that is much bigger and has much higher scale. So that's it for week 5 content. Stay tuned for the summary of the whole course that Mark and I are going to do next.